The General Belgrano began life as the Brooklyn-class light cruiser USS Phoenix, whose career and specifications are covered in a video that we've already published on that class. Along with the USS Boise, the ship was sold to Argentina in the early 1950s. The Boise was renamed to the Nuevo de Julio, or 9th of July, the date of Argentinian independence. The Phoenix was renamed to 17 de Octubre, or 17th of October, the so-called People's Loyalty Day. Both ships would be involved in a coup in 1955 in which the president was overthrown. Shortly after this, the ship was renamed as the General Belgrano, after an officer who had fought for Argentine independence in the 19th century and founded a school of navigation, before also having effectively founded the Argentine Navy. In so doing, she became the second ship to have this name, taking the place of a 19th century armoured cruiser that had been in service for about 50 years and had only been scrapped a few years previously. The next year, 1956, she was accidentally rammed by her sister ship whilst on exercises and was docked for repairs. In the next decade, as technology advanced, it became clear that the ship's 40mm anti-aircraft guns were unlikely to be able to protect her against aerial threats in any kind of serious conflict. And since both Chile and Brazil were modernizing their own armed forces, Belgrano was due for an upgrade. Therefore, some of the anti-aircraft armament was removed in favour of the Seacat missile system, the world's first short-range point defence missile to reach operational status, and one designed to be able to replace the 40mm installation without much modification to the ship in question. Ironically, as it would later turn out, the system was British, but for the moment it offered protection against close-range attacks by subsonic jets, large cruise missiles, and also against small ships and attack craft. The refit needed to add a pair of these launchers to the ship was completed by 1968. After that, the ship's career appears to have been relatively quiet, consisting largely of training cruises and patrols of various territories Argentina actually owned, and a few that she claimed but didn't actually control. In the meantime, Argentina went back and forth politically between a military dictatorship, then bringing the old president back, then his wife taking over when he died, and then back to a military dictatorship again. During this second round of military rule, the economy declined rapidly, and the general in charge decided that the best way to distract and unite the people was to have a war. Since it was not supposed to be a proper war where you might actually lose a lot of people, he could not go to war with Chile, since the Chileans might actually have won. But in the early 1980s, he thought instead that taking the nearby Falkland Islands away from the British might do the trick. The Argentines had claimed the island for decades, and the Americans had so far backed Argentina's actions in general in order to keep left-wing political parties from gaining a foothold in that part of South America. Therefore, in 1982, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands. When Britain did the unexpected and vowed to fight to take them back, the Argentine Navy was dispatched to stop them. This was primarily the job of a pair of task forces. In the north, the aircraft carrier 25 de Mayo, ironically also ex-British, the HMS Venerable, alongside two Type 42 destroyers, also amusingly British designs, sailed with three French-designed corvettes, which were perhaps a more appropriate enemy force for the Royal Navy. In the south, two ex-American Sumner-class destroyers accompanied the Belgrano. Both sets of ships were skirting the edge of the 200-mile radius total exclusion zone around the Falklands, an area in which the British had said any ship not belonging to them was liable to be sunk without warning. But on the 30th of April, the Belgrano and her escorts were detected by the nuclear-powered submarine HMS Conqueror, which started to follow them. The next day, all Argentine naval vessels were ordered to find and attack the British task force, presumably with the Belgrano approaching the task force as it was distracted by air attack from the north, and then using its superior gun-based firepower to sink enemy ships. But this message was intercepted by the British. As a result, on the 2nd of May 1982, the Conqueror fired 3 torpedoes at the Belgrano. Interestingly, although she was actually equipped with modern Tigerfish homing torpedoes, there were issues with this particular weapon's reliability, and so instead the Conqueror used 3 Mark 8 torpedoes, straight-running weapons from the Second World War that were about as old as the Belgrano herself. Of the 3 torpedoes fired, a pair of them hit the ship. The first blew off the front end of the ship, but the bulkheads held. The second, however, blew a massive hole in the ship just aft of the back end of the armour plating and knocked out all electrical power. Within minutes, it was clear that the ship was doomed. In the darkness, the ship's escorts somehow missed the Belgrano being hit, and one of them was even hit by the third torpedo, but because this was at the end of its run, it didn't actually detonate. Eventually, they realised what had happened and turned back, but as a result of the delay and bad weather, a total of 323 of those aboard lost their lives, about 275 in the torpedo explosions, and roughly 50 more to the weather afterwards. 772 men, including the captain, were rescued. Well, that's it for the service history of the General Belgrano. So if you wanted to know the history of the ship, then of course you can leave now. But you might notice that you haven't had your regular outro, and that I'm still talking, and there's still a bit of runtime. So if you want to learn a bit more about the circumstances of the sinking, please keep watching. Okay, so the sinking of the Belgrano has generated quite a bit of controversy over the years. At the various times, elements of the British Labour Party and some of the Argentine government claimed that the attack was illegitimate. Obviously, the Royal Navy and the British government have claimed that it was legal. But what is the actual truth of the matter? Well, first, we must dismiss the ideas of the Labour Party, as they were the minority opposition and were therefore especially biased in trying to find any fault whatsoever with the British government of the time, who, until the war started, looked likely to lose the next election. Likewise, we can safely ignore the Argentine government at the time. This might seem harsh, but in their statement the day after the sinking, they claimed amongst other things that Argentina was adhering to the United Nations advocated ceasefire, when in fact they just instructed all their naval units to attack the British task force 3 days before, and had not rescinded that order at the time of the sinking. So they're quite obviously also unreliable. For fairness, and because nobody trusts politicians, we must also dismiss the statements and claims of the British government of the time as well, since although they made the decision and sought out legal advice beforehand, if they had made a mistake, they're not exactly likely to admit it afterwards. Instead, we're going to look at 3 points of view, that of the respective navies involved, and that of the pure legal position. The main arguments put forward claiming the sinking was not legitimate are that the ship was outside the exclusion zone and therefore could not be attacked, that the ship was sailing away from the task force and therefore was not a threat and so should not have been attacked, and finally that the peace plan proposed by Peru had arrived and that any hostility should have been avoided until that plan was discussed and addressed. The last point is the most easily addressed. Whilst it's true that the plan was sent to Britain about half a day before the torpedoes were fired, all records that are available indicate that no relevant member of the British government had actually seen the plan until after the Belgrano had been sunk. With regards to the other issues, starting with the legal perspective, the Belgrano was outside the 200-mile radius exclusion zone that the British had established. However, in a message passed to the Argentine government over a week before the sinking, the British had made it clear that the exclusion zone was an area in which any ship was liable to be attacked, but they also specified that any Argentine ship or aircraft considered hostile or a threat would be engaged wherever they were found, not just in the exclusion zone. Since such zones are not mandatory in war, the British were free to do this, and indeed the normal rules of war allow for enemy craft to be engaged anywhere on the high seas. That this was understood on both sides is proven by the Argentine admiral in charge of Belgrano's task force, who stated, "After the message of 23rd of April, the entire South Atlantic was an operational theatre for both sides. We, as professionals, said that it was just too bad that we'd lost the Belgrano." From the British naval perspective, to answer the claim that the ship was sailing away, the answer of the British admiral in charge of the Royal Navy forces in the area stated the somewhat obvious. The speed and direction of an enemy ship can be irrelevant, because both can change quickly. What counts is his position, his capability, and what I believe to be his intention. This can be seen in many naval actions. For example, when it was caught, the Bismarck was headed for France, not a convoy. The Roma was heading for Malta, and not Germany, and the Musashi was headed north away from American forces when it was sunk. However, nobody suggests that simply because these ships were heading away from their immediate enemies at the time, that they were therefore not a threat and therefore not a legitimate target. Now, you might expect that from a legal and a British perspective, and plenty of media reports have been made about the supposed position of Argentina and so-called veterans of the ship or the war, despite the fact that many of these supposed veterans are not actually old enough to even have been born in 1982. Regardless of those, let's look at the opinions of Argentine naval officers. As we've already seen, the admiral in charge of the task force Belgrano was part of appears to accept the action as legitimate. In 1994, the Argentine Defense Ministry released a report which described the sinking of the General Belgrano as a legal act of war, explaining that acts of war can be carried out in all of the enemy's territory, and they can also take place in those areas over which no state can claim sovereignty, as in international waters. Further, the head of the Argentine Navy in the 1990s wrote that the General Belgrano was part of an operation that posed a real threat to the British task force, but was holding off from engaging for tactical reasons. He added to leave the exclusion area was not to leave the combat zone to enter a protected area. He then explicitly stated that the sinking was not a war crime, but a combat action. Finally, the captain of the Belgrano himself published a book in 1992 in which he wrote that it is improper to accept that the attack by HMS Conqueror was a betrayal. During an interview in 2003, he said that General Belgrano was only temporarily sailing to the west at the time of the attack, and his orders were to attack any British ships which came within range of the cruiser's armament. Therefore, it can be concluded that from the point of view of the officers in both navies, and from a legal perspective, the sinking of the Belgrano was a legitimate act of war. Unfortunately for the memory of the brave men who died aboard her, their deaths have since been used by politicians to try and further other agendas. But that's why this channel is about warships and not politics.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.